What if the richest man in Montana showed up at your door? In muddy boots, changing your tire in the rain, asking for nothing? What if he worked beside you every single day and never once told you who he really was? And what if the moment you finally trusted him was the moment everything fell apart? This is not a story about money. This is a story about a woman who sat down in the dirt and waited for a broken horse to trust her, and never realized someone was doing the exact same thing for her. This story will remind you that trust is not a feeling. It is a decision, made slowly, in small moments, every single day. Welcome to a channel where the plains run wide and the hearts run deeper. We tell stories of cowboys and courage, of love earned through calluses and patience. If that is the kind of story that stays with you long after it ends, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. The story begins now.
The morning Nora Callahan received the foreclosure notice, the sky over Montana was the kind of blue that felt like a personal insult. Wide and clean and absolutely indifferent to the fact that everything was ending. Not a single cloud. Not the courtesy of bad weather to match a bad morning. Just that relentless, open, impossible blue, stretching from the Beartooth Range all the way to the flat eastern horizon, like the sky had decided today was a beautiful day, and was not interested in anyone's opinion to the contrary. She was standing at the end of the gravel drive when the mail carrier stopped. She saw the certified letter envelope before he handed it over, and she knew before she opened it. Dusty Creek Savings and Loan. The return address she had memorized from 2 previous letters that had said the same thing in softer language. This one did not use soft language. $180,000 outstanding. 30 days to cure the default or the property proceeds to foreclosure. There was a phone number for the collections department and a name, someone named Gerald, and a note that said Gerald was available Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and would be happy to discuss payment options. Nora folded the letter in thirds. She tucked it into the breast pocket of her work shirt, directly over her sternum, where she could feel the paper against her skin when she breathed. Then she walked to the barn. Callahan Ridge was 40 acres of grass and fence, and the particular kind of quiet that comes from land that has been worked with patience for a long time. Her father, Thomas, had bought the original 5 acres 20 years ago with money he had saved from 2 decades of ranch work, and built the house himself over one long summer with help from Pete Rourke, who at that point was just a neighbor with carpentry skills and opinions about load-bearing walls. The barn had come 3 years later. The rescue operation had started unofficially before the barn was finished, because Thomas Callahan had never been able to drive past a horse in bad circumstances without stopping, and at a certain point the stopping had become a system. The system was now 12 horses, 2 with leg injuries still in the process of healing, one that had been found in an abandoned property outside of Billings with a wire cut along her shoulder that had been left untreated long enough to scar, one that had spent 3 days in a dry lot with no water access and still flinched when a hand moved too fast near her face. The remaining 8 were somewhere in the long middle ground between damaged and recovered, which was the only spectrum Callahan Ridge had ever dealt in. None of them were what a person would call easy horses. Thomas had not been interested in easy horses. Above the barn door he had nailed a cedar plank, hand-lettered in red paint that had faded in 20 years of Montana weather but had not disappeared. Every damaged thing deserves a second chance. Nora had read those words more times than she could count. She did not read them this morning. She walked under them and went to work. The oldest horse in the rescue was a bay gelding named Scout. 22 years old, wide through the chest, with the settled patience of an animal that had been through enough to stop being surprised by much. Thomas had pulled him from an auction kill pen when Scout was 2 years old and Nora was 12. And Scout had been at Callahan Ridge through everything that had happened since then, which was more than Nora cared to inventory on a morning like this. He put his head over the stall door as she came down the aisle and rested it against her shoulder with the unhurried weight of a horse that had been doing this for 20 years and saw no reason to change the habit. She stopped. Her hand went up to his jaw and rested there. 3 seconds exactly. Then she moved on. She had used up all her tears the previous November, standing in frozen ground at her father's graveside with the wind coming off the mountains, and Pete Rourke standing beside her not saying anything, because Pete understood that the correct response to some things was silence. What was left now, 14 months later, was just the work. The morning feeding, the stall cleaning, the medical checks, the slow, incremental daily effort of keeping 12 horses alive and moving toward something better than what they had come from. She was measuring out the morning grain when Pete appeared in the barn doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the Dusty Creek Courier folded under his arm. He was 67 years old and had the weathered, economical look of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors doing physical work and had made peace with all of it. He set 1 cup on the feed room shelf, kept the other, and put the newspaper on the same shelf with a certain deliberateness that Nora recognized as Pete trying to appear casual about something he was not casual about. She looked at the paper. He had circled an advertisement in the classifieds with a red pen, the kind of circling that said, "This is the thing I actually came in here to show you. Hargrove Land and Cattle. Experienced horse trainer sought for semi-wild herd rehabilitation program. $4,500 per month. Room and board provided on-site. Immediate start date. References required. Contact Ruth McKay, ranch manager." Nora read it twice. She picked up her coffee. She said, "I am not leaving the rescue to go work somebody else's horses," Pete said, not looking up from his own coffee. "June is coming this weekend. She can handle morning and evening feeding. It is 15 miles north, not 1,500. Pete. $4,500 a month, Nora, against a $180,000 debt. He let that arithmetic sit in the air between them for a moment. That is 10 months of aggressive payment. That is breathing room. I do not want to talk about it. All right. He picked up his coffee and walked back out to the barn aisle. And she could hear him talking quietly to Scout the way he did every morning, the low, steady murmur of a man who had never felt the need to perform his affections for anyone's benefit. Nora looked at the newspaper. She put it down on the shelf. She picked it up again. That afternoon, the wind changed. It came out of the northwest without warning, the dry, shifting kind that turned the grass brittle and moved through the valley like a slow reminder that the land did not belong to anyone for very long. It was the kind of wind that made the horses restless and shortened everyone's temper, and dried out the water troughs faster than they should have dried. Pete stood at the fence line for a long moment, looking at the sky in the northwest, the particular quality of attention he gave to weather that mattered. "Ground is thirsty, Miss Nora. Thirsty ground does not keep promises." She looked at the pasture, yellower than last month, the grass going stiff and pale at the tips. Looked at the main water tank, the marker float 4 inches below the safety line. Looked at the hay shed where the winter supply was stacked, less of it than she needed. The arithmetic of the shortfall already running in her head the way it had been running for months. She thought about Gerald at the collections department, available Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, happy to discuss options. She folded the newspaper and put it in her back pocket. The mail carrier had said one other thing that morning, almost to himself, the words trailing behind him as he walked back to his truck. "Heard Mr. Vane has been asking around about your place. Just saying." He had driven off before she could ask what he meant by it. Douglas Vane. She knew the name the way everyone in Dusty Creek County knew the name, the way you know the names of people who occupy certain rooms in the local order of things. President of the bank, county commissioner. The man her father had referred to in the particular flat tone Thomas Callahan reserved for people he had measured and found to be a specific kind of problem, as a man who has never built anything himself and has decided that makes buying things easier. Standing at the fence in the dry afternoon wind, she thought about that for the first time since the mail carrier had said it. Then she went inside and called the number in the ad. The next morning she was up at 4:30, which was not unusual, and on the road by 6:30, which was not unusual either, driving her 2009 Ford F-250 north on the county road toward Hargrove Land and Cattle. The F-250 had 212,000 miles on it, and a heating system that worked on its own schedule, and a rear bumper that had been replaced twice and was currently held to the frame, with 2 bolts and optimism. It was her father's truck, technically, in the sense that he had bought it and driven it for 9 years before she inherited it along with everything else. She had never gotten around to changing the registration. The access road to Hargrove land and cattle was 2 miles of washboard gravel between the highway turnoff and the main gate, running through open rangeland with the mountains visible to the west, and nothing else in any direction except grass and fence posts and the occasional hawk working the thermals above the road. She was halfway down it when the left rear tire went. Not a slow leak. A blowout, the tire going flat in the time it took her to register the sound and pull over onto the shallow shoulder. She got out and looked at it. She had a spare in the bed and a hydraulic jack and a lug wrench in the toolbox. She had all the equipment necessary to change the tire. She did not have the arm strength to break the lug nuts loose, which had been rusted solid for approximately 2 years, and which she had noted and intended to address, and had not yet addressed because there were always 12 more urgent things on the list. She was crouched next to the wheel with both hands on the lug wrench, and getting nowhere when she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. He came over the low ridge to the east on foot, which was the first thing she registered. No truck visible anywhere, no horse. Just a man walking the road the way a person walks when they know the land well enough to move through it without requiring anything extra. Worn Wranglers faded at the knees and thighs. A flannel shirt and a dark green and brown plaid that had been washed many times. Work boots with red clay ground into the treads and up the sides, the specific red clay of the subsoil in this part of the county. He did not ask if she needed help. He came over and crouched down next to the wheel and looked at the situation for about 3 seconds, then repositioned the lug wrench to a better angle and applied his body weight to it in the methodical way of someone who had changed tires in bad conditions many times and had learned that patience was more useful than force. The first nut came loose. He moved to the second. She stood back and let him work. In 11 minutes, the spare was on and torqued, and the flat was in the bed. He stood and dusted his hands on his jeans and nodded once, the brief nod of someone who has done a job and considers it done. He started walking. She said, "Thank you. I am Nora Callahan." He stopped. There was a pause before he turned around, short but present. "Cole, you work at the Hargrove place?" Another pause, half a second too long for a simple question, though she would not understand why until later. "Yes, ma'am, I work there." She got in the truck and drove. The interview took place at the kitchen table of the main ranch house, conducted by a woman named Ruth Mackay, who had the sharp, efficient bearing of someone who had been running a working operation for a long time and had stopped having patience for anything that wasted her time. 50s, close-cropped gray hair, the kind of handshake that told you something. Coffee appeared without being offered or requested, which Nora took as a good sign. 3 questions about her experience with horses, a review of her written references, a specific question about her approach to horses that had previous trauma, which Nora answered in concrete terms because she did not believe in answering practical questions abstractly. Everything moved efficiently until Ruth said, "You would be working directly with the owner. He has been personally involved in the rehabilitation program since he started it. Is that comfortable for you?" Nora said, "Who is the owner?" Ruth's expression did not shift by any measurable amount. "He will introduce himself." The back door opened and the man from the road came in. He was still in the flannel shirt, still in the boots with the red clay. He pulled out the chair across from Nora and sat down in it with the ease of a man who had been occupying that chair for years and had no uncertainty about his right to it. He said, "I am Cole Hargrove. I own the ranch." Nora looked at him. She thought about the lug wrench, the methodical patience, the 11-minute tire change with no conversation and no performance. She thought about the calluses she had noticed on his palm when he handed the wrench back to her, the specific kind that came from sustained physical work, not from an afternoon of recreational effort. She thought about a man worth more money than the entire county combined walking his own access road alone at 8 in the morning like a person with nowhere particular to be. She said, "All right," his offer. The job was hers. She would start the following morning with a practical evaluation. The mare named Ember, a 7-year-old Mustang with a scar along her left shoulder from a wire fence and eyes that had learned to treat every human approach as a threat, requiring calculation. 3 previous trainers had quit. 2 of them had specifically said the horse was not workable. Nora reached across the table and they shook hands. His palm was dry and his grip was brief, and his hand had the kind of calluses that did not come from the gym, not the hand of a man with $340 million. She filed that observation away without knowing yet what file to put it in. She drove home in the long Montana dusk with the newspaper in her back pocket and the foreclosure letter still pressed against her sternum and a start time of 6 o'clock the following morning. The mountains to the west were orange and then pink and then gray, and Scout would need his evening check. And June was coming Saturday. And in 30 days, none of this would be hers if she did not find a way to hold it. She had one way. She had taken it. The west-facing round pen caught the early light at an angle that made the dust particles in the air glow like something deliberately arranged. It was 6:15 in the morning, and the temperature was 38 degrees, and the sky was the thin, pale blue of early autumn in high country. The kind of blue that promised cold later and kept its promises. Ember stood at the far rail with her body angled toward the gate, and her eyes doing what Nora had watched damaged horses do for the better part of her adult life, tracking, assessing. Running a continuous calculation on every variable in the immediate environment, because experience had taught her that the variables changed without warning and the penalty for inattention was paid in pain. The scar on her left shoulder caught the low morning light. 6 inches long, running diagonally from the point of the shoulder down toward the elbow, the hair grown back in a slightly different texture than the surrounding coat. Wire fence injury, untreated long enough to close without proper cleaning. There were other marks, too, subtler, the kind that did not leave visible scars, but changed the way an animal moved and held itself and responded to approach. Cole stood at the fence, arms folded across the top rail, chin resting on his forearms, watching without speaking. He had been there before Nora arrived, which she registered when she came through the barn and saw him already in position. He had not announced himself or explained his presence. He was simply there, the way a person is there when they own the land and have decided to observe something happening on it. Nora opened the gate and walked to the center of the pen. She did not bring a lead rope. She did not carry a flag or a lunge whip or a training stick or any of the tools that the previous 3 trainers had presumably brought in with their various methods and their various theories about the right way to reach a horse that had decided not to be reached. She was wearing the same work clothes she had worn to the interview, her old canvas jacket, her barn boots with the worn heel on the left side. She carried nothing. She walked to the center of the pen, sat down in the dirt with her knees drawn up, and turned her back to Ember. The mare's hooves shifted on the packed dirt. 1 step, then stillness. Nora focused on her breathing and waited. 15 minutes passed with no sound except the distant movement of the main herd in the north pasture and the occasional creak of the fence rail where Cole was leaning. 20 minutes. Ember moved once, 2 lateral steps along the rail, a repositioning rather than a retreat, and then went still again. 25 minutes. Nora's legs had gone cold through the canvas of her jeans, and the dirt under her was hard, and she stayed exactly where she was. At 28 minutes, she heard the hooves move. Not along the rail this time. Forward. 3 steps, then a pause long enough to be a genuine decision rather than a hesitation. 2 more steps, another pause. Then the remaining distance covered in one slow, continuous approach, the mare's head dropping as she came, the posture shifting from threat assessment to something that was not yet trust, but was at least the suspension of immediate hostility. Ember put her nose against the back of Nora's neck just below the hairline and breathed. The exhale was warm and slow, the particular breath of an animal letting something go. Nora's hands were resting on her knees. They closed into fists for 1 second, a reflex she did not entirely control, and then opened flat against her thighs. Cole, at the fence, saw the fists. He did not see her face. He saw her hands make the choice to stop bracing, to open and be still, and the thing that moved in his chest was not something he had a ready name for. He had been watching for something specific without knowing he was watching for it, and what he had just seen was not on his list of possibilities. Earlier in the session, when Cole had shifted his position along the top rail and caught the heel of his palm on a loose nail head, drawing a shallow cut that beaded blood immediately, Nora had glanced over at the sound of his sharp intake of breath. She had assessed the injury in what he estimated was about 1.5 seconds. Not with concern, not with the social obligation of checking that the person nearby was all right. With the flat, practiced efficiency of someone who had evaluated enough actual injuries in actual conditions to know immediately that this one required nothing. She had returned her attention to Ember without comment. The quality of that look had stayed with him. It did not fit the picture he was working with. He stood at the fence for a long time after Nora finally stood and walked out of the pen, leaving Ember watching her departure with the focused attention of a horse that has discovered something it wants to keep track of. Cole thought about the 17 trainers he had hired in 5 years. He thought about the methods they had brought and the varying degrees of patience they had demonstrated, and the ways they had each eventually decided that this particular horse was the problem rather than the approach. Not one of them had sat down in the dirt and waited. The thought that arrived, quiet and inconvenient, was that he was not entirely sure which one of them had just been evaluated. That evening, he sat at the ranch office desk with the laptop open and his grandfather's folding knife in his hand, turning it the way he did when he was thinking. Bone handle, blade kept sharp out of habit. The knife his grandfather had carried for 40 years before Cole inherited it, along with the 40 dry acres that had become Hargrove land and cattle and eventually Hargrove Holdings, the only object he had kept from before the money. He carried it every day and was not entirely sure he could explain why, except that it was the one thing in his possession that remembered who he had been before he became what he was. The laptop screen showed the Hargrove Holdings financial dashboard and 3 urgent messages from his attorney in Billings about the Caldwell Basin acquisition. The deal had been moving for 14 months. $89 million of rangeland in the Yellowstone River corridor, the kind of acquisition that happened once in a career if it happened at all. His lead competitor, a Denver developer named Grant Whitfield, had submitted a formal competing offer. The landowners were considering both bids. Cole had a window of approximately 10 days to respond personally before the window closed. He looked at the messages for a while. Then his phone rang and he picked it up. His Uncle Dale said, "You are still doing this." Cole said, "I am working my own ranch. You are performing poverty on a $12 million property while simultaneously ignoring a 9-figure acquisition because you have decided the answer to your romantic difficulties is to pretend to be a different person." That is a reductive summary. It is an accurate summary with a shorter word count. A pause. What is she like? Cole looked out the window toward the barn. The light was on in the aisle, the warm yellow of the overhead fluorescence visible through the gap in the sliding door. Nora doing her final check on Ember before calling it a night. She had been in the barn for 12 hours. She had eaten a lunch he had watched her forget about until Pete put it directly in her hands. He said, "She read the entire employment contract before she signed it." Dale was quiet for a moment. "That is not what I asked. It is the answer I have right now." He set the phone down and looked at the window for a long time. Then he closed the laptop without responding to the messages from Billings and went to bed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that nobody designed. Cole came to the barn at 5:30. Nora had been there since 5, which he discovered the first morning and had not commented on and had noted every morning since. They worked through the feeding and the stall cleaning and the medical checks in a natural division of labor that they had not discussed and did not need to discuss. The near stalls her territory, the far stalls his, the space between them organized by an unspoken efficiency that felt in a way Cole found difficult to categorize, like something that had existed before they arrived at it. Montana morning fog, the low, dense kind, reduced the visible world to 10 feet in any direction. The mountains disappeared. The road disappeared. The house disappeared. What remained was the barn and the horses, and the particular companionable quiet of two people doing familiar work in a space made temporarily small by weather. By the end of the first week, Ruth had stopped appearing in the barn doorway to observe. In the second week, on a cold, clear Tuesday morning, Ember allowed Nora's hand on her back for the first time. No saddle, no halter, no equipment of any kind. Just a palm laid flat between the mare's shoulder blades and held there while Ember considered the situation and decided, after a long moment, not to move away. Cole stood in the doorway of the barn and watched. Pete appeared behind him without sound, the way Pete appeared places, and said quietly, 11 years around horses. Never seen that done with this one. Cole said nothing. He was watching Nora's face, which he could see in profile from the doorway. She was looking at the horse with the specific focused expression of a person doing something that requires their complete attention. And there was something in it, a quality of presence, an absence of performance, that made him stand in the doorway longer than he intended to. Third dinner. Ruth had made beef stew and cornbread from scratch, the kind of cooking that did not announce itself, just appeared on the table and was exactly what the weather and the hour required. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke from the range and the faint mineral smell of cold coming through the window sill. Cole and Nora sat across from each other at the rough-hewn table. Pete had eaten earlier, as Pete preferred to do, and was somewhere in the barn doing the last check of the evening with the portable lantern he had been using for 15 years and intended to use until it stopped working. June had called that afternoon. Nora had answered in the barn and had the brief conversation in the particular tone she used with June, which was a combination of genuine affection and the preemptive weariness of someone who knows what questions are coming. June had asked if Cole was good-looking. Nora had said he worked like a regular person. June had said that was not an answer. Nora had said it was the answer she had. June had said she was driving up Saturday, whether invited or not. Nora had not argued, which was its own kind of invitation. Cole asked about Thomas Callahan. He framed it as a single question about how her father had started the rescue, which was technically one question but functioned as an open door. He asked it, and then he waited, which was, Nora had noticed, something he was better at than most people. Waiting without filling the space. She answered in short sentences. The original 5 acres. The first horse, Scout, pulled from a kill pen auction when she was 12 because Thomas had driven past the auction and had not been able to keep driving. The way the operation had grown by the logic of one horse at a time, which was not a business logic, but was a consistent logic. The cedar plank above the barn door that he had painted himself with house paint left over from the kitchen renovation. Cole did not redirect. He did not offer parallel stories about his own history or turn the conversation toward more comfortable ground. He listened with the quality of attention that Nora associated with surgeons, and the better kind of senior enlisted personnel, people who had learned that listening was a skill that required practice, and that most people did not practice it enough. For the first time in 14 months, she finished her whole plate without running through the next morning's task list in her head. Near the end of the meal, Cole looked at the cornbread in his hand and said thoughtfully, not unkindly, the way a person says something that seems logical from where they are sitting. 40 acres is workable ground. If you restructured the pasture rotation and brought in a small breeding program, the operation could sustain itself financially within a reasonable time frame. Nora set her fork down. She said, "My father did not build that land to turn a profit." Cole stopped. She said, "He built it because he believed something. Not with anger, not with the protective heat of someone defending an attack. With the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone stating a thing that is simply true and does not require defense." Then she picked up her fork and finished her cornbread. Cole was quiet for the rest of the meal. But the quality of his quiet was different from before. He was not simply sitting with the comfortable silence of a man at his own table. He was thinking. She could see it in the particular stillness of someone working through something they had not expected to need to work through. He was thinking about a man who had built 40 acres of rescued horses because he believed something, and what the inside of a life built on belief rather than calculation looked like, and whether he had ever made a decision in his own life that fit that description. He was not sure that he had. A week into the job, Cole handed Nora his grandfather's knife to cut a length of baling twine she could not reach her own blade to. He did it without thought, handle first, the automatic gesture of a person with a tool in hand who is standing next to someone who needs it. She took it, cut the twine, handed it back. He put it in his pocket. He did not understand until later that evening, sitting on the porch in the cold with the knife in his hand, that he had owned that knife for 24 years and had never handed it to another person before. He was not sure what to do with that information, so he put the knife in his pocket and went inside. The east fence came down on a Tuesday night, not dramatically, not in any weather event, just the accumulated pressure of a dry season working at the base posts until the weakest section found its limit. Cole and Nora went out in the rain that followed, Montana horizontal rain, the cold, driving kind that made plans irrelevant and turned the access road to mud in 15 minutes. They worked in the dark with headlamps and in the rain without speaking, setting posts and running wire. Hands too cold after the first 20 minutes to feel the wire properly, but functioning adequately on muscle memory. The kind of work that does not require conversation, and is in some ways better without it. Cole said at some point in the second hour, "You never complain." Nora said, "Does complaining set fence posts?" He looked at her. The rain was running off the brim of her hat, and her jacket was soaked through, and she was on her third post hole of the evening, and she said it not as a joke, not as a performance of toughness, but as a genuine inquiry about the practical utility of complaint. He laughed. A real one, the short, surprised sound of a man who had not planned to laugh and found himself doing it anyway. The particular laugh of someone who has spent enough time around people who perform everything that encountering someone who does not perform anything lands like a physical sensation. She registered the sound the way you register a change in the air pressure before a weather shift. Something had moved. She drove another staple into the post and told herself it was nothing to make note of. 3 nights later, at 11 o'clock, Nora found Ringo standing wrong in his stall. The young quarter-horse gelding had his left front leg in the guarded position of an animal managing pain rather than resting. Weight shifted subtly right, the faint sweating of a horse whose body is working harder than the temperature warranted. She did not wake Cole. She did not go to the house. She got the first aid kit and the soaking tub and spent 45 minutes doing what the situation required with the methodical patience of someone trained to function under pressure in conditions that did not accommodate uncertainty. She applied the poultice wrap with the care of a person who understood that the work done in the next 30 minutes would determine the animal's comfort for the next week. She wrote the note on a piece of paper from her jacket pocket and taped it to the stall door. Ringo, possible abscess, left front, wrapped and medicated. Watch him in the morning. She signed it N. Cole found it at 5:30. He stood in front of the stall door and read it twice. Ruth came down the barn aisle behind him, looked over his shoulder, said nothing. But he saw her expression shift by a fraction of a degree in the direction of a conclusion she was keeping to herself. He thought about a woman who got up in the middle of the night to treat a horse that was not technically her responsibility, who did not wake anyone, who did not make a note of it to be acknowledged later, who simply saw a thing that needed doing, and did it, and left evidence only because the evidence was medically relevant. He was awake before his alarm that morning, and every morning after. He told himself it was the ranch schedule adjusting. He was a man who had considerable experience lying to himself convincingly, and it took him 4 more days before he admitted, alone in the office in the dark before dawn, that he was looking at the barn to see if the light was on. It always was. By the end of the second week, Cole Hargrove had stopped setting his alarm for 5:30. He was already awake. He was a man accustomed to lying to himself with great confidence, so it took several more days to admit that the barn light was the reason. Nora drove into Dusty Creek on the 1st of the month to make the initial payment on the debt from her first paycheck. It was a Tuesday, overcast, the specific gray of a Montana sky that is considering weather but has not committed yet. The drive took 20 minutes on the county road, and she used it to run the numbers she had been running every day since the foreclosure letter. The arithmetic of $4,500 a month against a $180,000 principal, with the interest accumulating in the background like a second problem she was not supposed to look at directly. Dusty Creek Savings and Loan was a brick building with a faded green awning on Main Street between the pharmacy and the insurance office. Inside it smelled like carpet cleaner, and the particular combination of paper and air conditioning that banks had smelled like since before Nora was born. The lobby had 4 teller windows and a rack of brochures about home equity products, and a framed photograph of the Beartooth Range that someone had decided was aspirational. She was finishing at the teller window when the door to the back office opened and Douglas Vane came out. She had seen him before. County commission meetings that Thomas had sometimes attended in the last years, when the commission was making decisions that affected grazing rights and water access in the area. She had sat in the folding chairs at the back of the community center and watched her father stand at the public comment microphone and say what needed saying in the plain, direct way Thomas Callahan said everything. And she had watched Douglas Vane in his seat at the long table listen with the particular expression of a man who has already made the decision and is waiting patiently for the speaking portion to conclude. Gray suit today, well cut, polished dress boots, the easy, proprietary smile of a man who had never had to wonder whether a room would accommodate him, because every room he entered had always accommodated him without being asked. He said, "Miss Callahan, good to see you coming in." He said it like she was visiting a neighbor, like they were friends, like there was nothing at all unusual about the president of the bank coming out of the back office to greet a customer who owed his institution $180,000. He said, "Callahan Ridge is a beautiful piece of land. Would be a real shame to see it go through the formal foreclosure process. A clean sale between reasonable people is always better for everyone involved." She said, "I am paying on time." He said, "This time." He let that sit for a moment in the lobby air between them, easy and unhurried. $4,500 a month does not retire a $180,000 debt in 30 days, Miss Callahan. You know the math as well as I do. He smiled again, the specific smile of a man delivering what he considers useful information rather than a threat. Be a real shame to let it get to the ugly stage. He knew the exact salary. He knew the exact debt figure. Somebody had told him both. He said, "I will be in touch," like it was a kindness, and walked back to his office. Nora drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and the window down despite the cold because she needed the air moving. She went directly to Pete in the hay shed and told him the whole conversation. He came down from the half-finished repair he was doing on the loft floor and sat on a hay bale and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Douglas Vane has owned the 40-acre parcel east of your property for 4 years, and the 20 acres west of it for 6. Your land is the gap between his 2 pieces." He looked at the hayshed wall. "He has a zone variance from the county commission to develop a resort and conference facility, approved 2 years ago. He needs your parcel to make the footprint work." She was quiet. He said, "Your father received 3 separate purchase offers over the last 5 years. He turned down all 3. The last one came in about 6 months before he got sick. He knew the debt was going to be a problem. He thought he had more time. He thought there were solutions he had not found yet." Pete was quiet for a moment. "He was working on it, Nora. He just ran out of time before he found the answer." Saturday morning, June arrived in her blue Honda with a bag of groceries and the specific energy of a person who has been told to relax about something and has decided that relaxing about it requires going to see it in person. She found Cole and Nora on the south fence replacing boards that had gone soft from 3 years of wet springs, Cole with a pry bar and his knees in the mud, Nora handing him 16 penny nails from a coffee can and pointing out which boards could be salvaged and which could not with the authority of someone who had been watching that particular fence deteriorate for 2 years. June pulled Nora aside by the water trough, while Cole was occupied with a board that was arguing with him. She said, "People in town say Cole Hargrove is worth $300 million minimum." Nora said, "Okay." "He is currently in the mud with a pry bar. The fence needs replacing." Nora, "Why is a man worth $300 million personally replacing fence boards on a Tuesday morning in the mud?" Nora said, "Because this is a ranch, and on a ranch people do physical work to maintain the physical property, regardless of what they're worth." June looked back at Cole, who had now gotten into what appeared to be a genuine disagreement with a fence post, addressing it in a low, serious voice that was not entirely without a quality June found inconveniently charming. She looked back at Nora. "Or he does not want you to know who he really is, which means he has a reason for not wanting you to know, which means he has decided something." Nora did not respond. That night she lay awake in the dark of the farmhouse bedroom and ran the evidence the way she had been trained to run evidence, systematically, without the distortion of preference. The calluses on his hands, the flannel shirt that was not a costume. The wear pattern was wrong for a costume. The walking alone on the access road. The way he had stood in the barn for a long time looking at the note she had left on Ringo's stall door. The knife, the grandfather's knife, handed over without a thought, and then apparently forgotten. None of it added up to fraud. All of it added up to a man who was not where convention expected him to be, and who knew it, and who had chosen it anyway. She wanted him to tell her. That was what she decided in the dark. She would wait. She would see which one of them went first. The following week, Ruth handed Cole a folded message slip at dinner. He read it and set it face down on the table. Ruth said, "Cole?" He said, "I heard you." She said, "Whitfield submitted a formal competing offer. The landowners are engaged. You have 10 days to respond personally." He said, "I heard you, Ruth." She left the kitchen. He turned the message slip over and looked at it for a long time and then put it in his shirt pocket and did not call Billings. The weeks accumulated. The work continued. The dinners at the rough-hewn table became, without announcement, the part of each day that both of them arrived at without requiring a reason. The mornings in the fog-reduced barn, the fence work, the slow progress with Ember, who was learning incrementally and on her own terms, that the specific human who sat in the dirt and waited for her every day was a variable that could be categorized as safe. Cole's grandfather's knife appeared in Nora's hand twice more, passed over for practical reasons, returned without comment. Each time he watched her use it and return it, he thought about the fact that he had owned it for 24 years and had never handed it to another person. He was not sure this was significant. He thought about it often enough that significance seemed like a reasonable conclusion. The blue roan stallion came from a Bureau of Land Management auction on a gray Wednesday morning. Arrived in a stock trailer with the specific contained energy of an animal that had been wild and was now enclosed and had not yet arrived at any conclusions about how to handle that transition. 17 hands of unhandled horse, wide through the chest, plenty of bone, the kind of animal that in other circumstances would have commanded serious money at a performance horse sale. In these circumstances, he was a variable that required management. The plan was standard. Move him from the trailer to the isolation stall, 30 feet with 2 people and a lead rope. Slow and straightforward, the kind of move done dozens of times with dozens of horses. The wind changed at the wrong moment. A 5-gallon bucket on the fence caught the gust and came off the post it had been balanced on. Hit the ground at the worst possible angle. The aluminum ringing against the frozen dirt in exactly the register most likely to send an already nervous horse sideways without warning. The stallion went sideways. Cole was in the wrong position, too close and at the wrong angle, not because he was inattentive, but because the bucket had not been part of the plan, and plans do not accommodate buckets. The horse's left shoulder caught him with the full momentum of 1,200 pounds moving fast and drove him into the wall of the barn alley. He went down. The back of his head hit the wall on the way, and he sat on the ground with his left shoulder at a wrong angle and his vision doing something that was not entirely under his control for about 15 seconds. Ruth reached for her phone. Cole said from the ground with the irritated certainty of a man who has strong opinions about how he manages his own injuries. Put it down. Nora was already beside him. She did not ask permission. She held up 2 fingers, moved them left, moved them right, watched his tracking, took his wrist with 2 fingers over the pulse point, pressed 2 fingers into the hollow behind his left ear. She said, "Follow the fingers. Tell me if the pressure behind your ear hurts. Squeeze my right hand." He did all 3 things. She said, "Concussion is possible but not certain. Shoulder is soft tissue, not structural. You need ice on that shoulder and 30 minutes of horizontal and someone checking your responsiveness every 20 minutes for the next 2 hours." Cole said, "You know how to do this." Not a question. Nora said, "Army nurse. 2 tours. Afghanistan, 2009 through 2012. Ruth, still standing in the barn doorway with her phone in her hand, went completely still. Cole looked at the hands that had just done a neurological field assessment with the automatic confidence of a person for whom this was recalled procedure. He said, "That is why you look at injuries the way you do." She said, "What way?" "Like you already know what it is and you are confirming rather than discovering." She did not answer that. She helped him up. In the ranch kitchen, with Cole seated at the table in his shirt off, and his shoulder becoming the particular shade of purple that indicated serious soft tissue damage but nothing structural, Nora taped the joint with the efficient economy of someone who had done this in conditions where being fast and accurate was not a preference but a requirement. Combat field dressing was a different skill from ranch first aid, in the way that any skill performed under extreme conditions is different from the same skill performed under comfortable conditions. The hand remembered both. Cole watched her hands work. He said, "Why did you leave nursing?" She said, "I did not leave. I came back from my second tour and tried to go back into a hospital setting and found that I could not do it. People in hospitals misrepresent their pain. They minimize it because they think that is being polite, or they amplify it because they want more attention or more medication. After 2 years in forward operating conditions where the stakes were literal, I could not find a way to work in an environment where honesty about pain was optional." She cut the tape. She said, "Horses do not do that. They show you exactly what is wrong if you know how to look. They do not perform. They do not manage how they appear. They are always exactly what they are." Cole was quiet for a long time. She folded the tape dispenser closed and set it on the table. He said, "And the rescue was your father's idea." She said, "His idea. My decision to stay with it. There is a difference." She said it without weight, as a clarification rather than a statement about herself. But the distinction she was drawing, between what you inherit and what you choose, sat in the kitchen air and did not dissipate quickly. The first hard cold of the fall season arrived that night without the warning of a gradual shift, the temperature dropping 18 degrees between 7 in the evening and 3 in the morning, the kind of overnight drop Pete called the sky making up its mind. The cold came in dry and settled into the valley with the definitive quality of a decision that had been made somewhere else and was now being implemented here. After dinner, Cole sat on the porch with his shoulder wrapped and his grandfather's knife turning in his hands in the slow, absent way he had when he was working through something. The stars were dense and the cold was genuine, and the distant mountains were dark shapes against a slightly lighter dark. Nora came out with 2 cups of coffee. She set his on the porch railing without being asked or making a point of the gesture, the way you set coffee down for someone you have been doing the morning barn shift with long enough to know how they take it. She was turning to go back inside when Cole said, "You afraid of anything, Nora?" She stopped, did not turn around. The pause that followed was its own kind of answer about how rarely the question got asked and how seriously she was taking it. She said, "Losing my father's land and having nowhere to put the horses." He said, "That is the only thing." She said, "That is enough." She went inside. The door did not close hard, just the quiet click of a latch engaging, and Cole sat with his coffee in the cold and the dark, and thought about a woman who had done 2 tours in a combat zone and come home and chosen horses over people because horses did not lie about their pain, and who, when asked what she was afraid of, named a piece of land and 12 horses rather than anything about herself. Not because she was without fear of other things, but because the other things were not what she was willing to put words to at the moment. He thought about the note on Ringo's stall door. He thought about her hands choosing to open flat on her knees in the round pen. He thought about $340 million sitting in accounts and portfolios in Billings, and about how none of it could do anything about the specific thing she had said she was afraid of without changing everything else in the process. Cole Hargrove could have retired Nora Callahan's entire debt the following morning before he ate breakfast and not noticed the transaction against his operating balance for the quarter. That fact did not help him sleep. It kept him awake in the specific way that the most inconvenient truths are always awake before you are. The storm announced itself in the late afternoon with a drop in pressure that the horses felt before the instruments registered it. By 6 o'clock, the clouds had come in fast from the northwest, and the temperature had dropped 12 degrees in 90 minutes, and the first serious rain of the season was beginning. Not the tentative rain of the preceding weeks, but Montana rain with intent, horizontal and cold, the kind that made every plan made before it irrelevant. The electricity went at 8:15. The access road was already impassable by then, the gravel washed to mud in the low section by the gate, and the cottonwood at the north end of the pasture was moving in a way that cottonwoods were not built to move, and was going to lose something significant before morning. Cole came to the house kitchen where Nora was heating water on the propane range and said, "We need to check the horses." She had her jacket already on. They went together. The barn was warm relative to outside, the animals' collective body heat doing what it always did, and the overhead lights were out with the power, but they each had a headlamp, and the horses could be assessed by touch and proximity, and the baseline knowledge of what each animal's normal behavior sounded like. They worked methodically down the aisle, stall by stall, the rain hammering the metal roof in a continuous percussion that made conversation difficult, and the only available light coming from the headlamps and the white strobe of lightning through the high windows every 40 seconds or so. They were halfway down the aisle when the lightning struck the cottonwood. The sound came through the barn walls like a detonation, the crack and the bass resonance arriving almost simultaneously. And the horses responded in their various ways, the more settled animals shifting and blowing, the more damaged ones doing more than that. Ember, in the last stall, came apart completely. The mare had been making progress. 3 weeks of incremental work, Nora in the pen every morning with no agenda except presence, the slow, patient accumulation of evidence that this particular human was consistently safe. 3 weeks had moved Ember from active threat assessment to a cautious working tolerance, and 3 weeks of progress does not disappear in a moment, but it does not constitute a foundation for a lightning strike at close range either. Nora went into the stall without hesitation, the way she went into situations that required her presence without performing a calculation about the situation first. She sat down in the straw against the side wall, back to the horse, the position that had worked in the round pen on the first morning, and that she had been using in Ember's stall every evening for 3 weeks as the last element of the daily routine. The signal that said, "I am here, and I am the same as I was yesterday." Ember was not able to receive the signal. The mare was trembling in continuous waves, her body fully engaged in something larger than training progress. The lightning, and the sound, and the storm, too much incoming stimulus for the equipment her nervous system had been left with. And the cold had gotten through Nora's jacket during the run from the house, and she was shaking too, not from fear, but from actual cold, the wet jacket doing nothing useful against the temperature that had dropped another 6 degrees since they had come out. Cole came to the stall door. He stood and watched for a moment. Then he took off the outer flannel shirt, the worn green and brown plaid one he wore every morning, the one that had been washed so many times it had gone soft as flannel gets at the end of a long life, and held it through the stall bars without a word. She took it without a word. She put it on over her wet jacket, which was not warm immediately, but became warm faster than she expected. His warmth was in the fabric still. His smell, which she had been not noticing for 3 weeks with the specific effort of someone who is actively deciding not to notice something. Wood smoke and the cold water mineral smell of the well water he used. And underneath that something she did not have a precise name for, except that it was distinctly him. She did not look at him. She thought with the flat clarity of a person who has been trained to assess accurately and honestly under conditions of stress. I am in real trouble. Not a dramatic thought. Not accompanied by anything she would have identified as emotion in the moment. Just an accurate assessment of a change in conditions. The way she would note a change in a patient's vitals. The recognition that something had shifted, and that the shift was significant, and that it was going to require her to make decisions she had not yet made. They stayed in the barn through the storm. Cole sat on the other side of the stall door, on the floor with his back against the bars, his legs stretched out into the aisle. Nora on the straw inside, her back against the wall, Ember between them in the stall until the mare, exhausted by the sustained fear, put her head into the warmth between Nora's shoulder and the wall, and slowly, over the course of an hour, stilled. The rain hammered the roof like something counting. Their shoulders were against the bars from opposite sides, and they were not touching, but the bars were between them, and touching was not the operative category. They did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said in a way that words would have improved. Ember slept. The sky was clear and the ground was thoroughly soaked, and the cottonwood had lost a major limb to the storm's exactness when Cole opened his eyes and understood that he had fallen asleep against the bars with his head on his arm, and that his head was touching something that was not a bar. Nora's shoulder, through the bars. She was awake. Had been awake, from the quality of her stillness, for some time. She had left his head where it was. He said, "You did not move away." She said, "I did not want to wake the horse." Both of them knew that was not the reason. Neither of them said so. That afternoon, Nora was walking down the hall from the bathroom to the back door, and the office door was open a few inches, and Cole's voice was inside on the phone, and she heard him say, "No, Dale, she does not know. Nobody here knows Hargrove Holdings is mine." She stopped. She was one step past the door. She heard him say, "I know it is not healthy. I know what it looks like from the outside. But you do not understand what it is like. This is the first time in I do not know how long that someone has looked me in the eye and not been calculating something." She took one step back. Then she walked down the hall to the back door and went out to the barn. She had not heard the part about Hargrove Holdings clearly enough to parse it. She had heard the part about calculating. She had heard the specific loneliness in the voice of a man making a private confession to his uncle on a phone call he believed was private, the grief of someone who had been surrounded by people for a long time, and had never once felt that any of them were looking at the right thing. She knew he was hiding something. She had known for 3 weeks. She now knew what category of thing it was. A wound, not a scheme. A wound the same way Ember's wariness was a wound, the same way any animal's distrust after enough bad experience was a wound. The appropriate response to a wound was not confrontation. It was patience. It was being the same person every day and letting the evidence accumulate on its own. She would wait. She would see which one of them chose to go first. That evening, Ruth came to Cole's desk with a message slip and said, "Your attorney has been trying to reach you for 2 days. Whitfield submitted his formal offer on the Caldwell Basin deal. The landowners are in direct contact with his team. You have a 10-day response window." She set the slip on the desk. "Cole." He looked at the slip. He looked at the window. He set the slip face down on the desk. Ruth said his name again, with the particular weight of a woman who has worked for someone for 15 years and has accumulated the right to say what she is actually saying. He said, "I heard you, Ruth." She left. He did not call Billings. June called at 7:14 in the morning, which was not a time June called unless something had already gone wrong. Nora was at the water trough with a coffee cup in her hand, and Ember eating her morning hay in the adjacent stall, and she answered with the automatic alertness of someone who knew that early morning calls from people you loved were categorically different from the same call at a reasonable hour. June said, "Vane bought your debt." The water trough made its slow refill sound. Scout put his head over the stall door and looked at Nora. June said, "He went to the county commission meeting last night. Routine session, almost nobody there. He announced that he had purchased the outstanding debt on Callahan Ridge from the bank at par value. He said there is a default clause in the original loan documents, a missed insurance payment 7 months ago, and under the terms of the acquired debt, the repayment deadline is now 10 days, not 30. 10. Nora set down her coffee cup. She said, "I will call you back." She drove to Hargrove Land and Cattle and went directly to the barn because that was where Cole was at 7:45 in the morning. He was at the near end of the aisle doing a routine check on the blue roan, which had been settling well in the isolation stall, and he heard her truck and came to the barn door and saw her face and went still the way people go still when they recognize the quality of someone's expression. She said, "Do you know Douglas Vane?" There was a pause, half a second. Cole said, "I know the name." That was the wrong answer. Not because of what he said, because of the half-second before it, the specific half-second of a person who is navigating, and the navigating itself told her more than the answer. She said, "Does Hargrove Holdings have any contractual relationship with Douglas Vane?" Cole did not answer immediately. The silence was its own response, and both of them understood that. Nora set her truck keys on the fence post. She said, "Tell me who you are, all of it." Cole told it. Hargrove Holdings, $340 million in assets. Hargrove Land and Cattle was not a side project or a retirement hobby. It was one operational property in a holding structure that included commercial real estate in 4 states and international agricultural operations in 2 countries. The flannel shirt and the lug wrench and the rough-hewn table and the morning barn shifts were not a performance in the sense of being false. He had worked this land before the money, and the working of it was genuine. But the financial reality he had been presenting was not the financial reality that existed. 3 women, 3 broken engagements, one who had left when she discovered the actual net worth was lower than the rumored figure during a lean operational year, which had told him everything he needed to know about her actual calculus. 2 who had come specifically for the money and had not tried very hard to conceal that once they felt secure in the relationship. After the 3rd, he had decided he needed to know the answer to a specific question before he would try again. The question was whether there was a person who would see him rather than the number. And the clause, signed 11 years ago when he was 27 and needed capital and had trusted a handshake from a man who had proven in the time since that his handshakes were documents with small print. The clause gave Douglas Vane right of first refusal on any Hargrove Holdings asset transactions in Dusty Creek County in the event that Hargrove Holdings formally withdrew from the local market. Cole had not withdrawn. Vane had been engineering the conditions to force it. He had not intended to harm her. He had been careless in a way that years later had built the road that Vane was now walking. The distinction between negligence and malice was real, and it was also standing in the barn door at 8 in the morning with a woman who had just heard all of this, not the most important distinction available. When he finished, Nora was quiet. She said, "You could have paid off my debt the morning you hired me." He said, "Yes." She said, "You did not. Because you wanted to see if I would fall for you without knowing you were rich." He started to say something. She looked at Ember's stall door. The mare was at the door, watching Nora with the dark, careful eyes of an animal that had been building for 3 weeks an evidence-based assessment of whether this particular human was safe. The horse that had taken 28 minutes to cross a round pen. The horse that would not be hurried and could not be forced and had arrived at trust through the slow daily accumulation of consistent evidence. Nora looked at Ember for 3 seconds. She thought about sitting in the dirt. She thought about the note she had left on Ringo's stall door. She thought about all the work of convincing a damaged thing that it was safe to trust. And she thought about how she had not recognized while she was doing it that the same work was being done in the other direction, and she had not seen it because she had not been looking for it, because she had not believed anyone would think she was worth that much patience. She said, "Get out." The rest of that day and the following night were the darkest of the period. Not the darkest Nora had ever been through. She had a baseline for dark that predated this situation by several years, but dark in a specific personal way that the operational darkness of combat tours was not. That darkness had been external. This was the interior kind, the kind that comes from finding out that something you thought was one thing was also another thing simultaneously, and that both things were true, and that you had to find a way to live with the complexity of both being true at the same time. She sat in Ember's stall with her hand on the mare's neck and did not cry, and did not sleep, and did not make a decision. She just sat with it, in the particular way she had learned to sit with difficult things, which was without rushing it toward a conclusion it had not yet reached. June arrived at 10 in the evening, having driven from Missoula without being asked, and sat down in the stall without saying anything for 15 minutes. The horses shifted and breathed. The barn was dark except for the small flashlight June had brought, set on the ground beside them with its beam aimed at the wall, enough light to see by, not enough to be uncomfortable. Then June said, "Do you regret any of it, the last few weeks?" Nora was quiet for a long moment. "No." "Then you have your starting point." "It is not that simple." "I know it is not. But it is a starting point, and you did not have one an hour ago." Nora Callahan had 10 days before she lost her father's land. The one person in the world with the resources to stop it was the person she had just told to leave. The worst part, the part she did not say to June because it was not yet a thought she could say aloud, was that she had known for 3 weeks that he was hiding something. She had decided to wait for him to tell her. And the question she could not stop turning over in the dark was which one of them had been waiting for the other to be brave first, and whether both of them had waited too long. She worked for 3 nights. Kitchen table, yellow legal pad, Thomas's old laptop, the Dusty Creek County Property Records database, and the Vane Hargrove contract documents that Cole Briggs had gotten through a records request on the same day Nora had called her. Pete brought coffee at regular intervals and did not ask questions. June had driven back to Missoula after the first night because she had client work and because she had said what she came to say, and understood that the rest of it was Nora's work to do. The house was quiet, except for the sounds of an old building in cold weather and the distant settling of the barn. On the second night, Nora found the mechanism. The right of first refusal clause in the original Vane and Hargrove co-signing agreement had a specific activation condition. Hargrove Holdings had to formally, legally withdraw from the Dusty Creek County market. Not informally, not practically, not through neglect or inattention. Formally and legally a documented corporate action. Hargrove Land and Cattle was still operating as an active business entity in Dusty Creek County. The clause had not been activated. It was dormant. Vane had purchased the Callahan debt legally. His attempt to leverage that purchase to force a rapid distressed sale while the clause was dormant was potentially a violation of Montana banking statute, specifically the provision governing improper use of acquired financial instruments. The pressure he had applied in the bank lobby, the artificial timeline he had manufactured from the insurance default clause, the backroom meeting with his attorney about engineering conditions to force Cole's withdrawal, all of it assembled into a picture that Cole Briggs, reviewing it at 2 in the morning on the phone, described as a reasonably strong case for regulatory complaint and civil action. The problem was that to challenge Vane's use of the dormant clause in a county court filing, someone had to go on the record, establishing that Hargrove Land and Cattle was an active Hargrove Holdings asset in Dusty Creek County. Cole had never made that connection public locally. The filing required him to stand up publicly as who he was and acknowledge everything he had been concealing. She needed him to make that choice. She understood that she could not make it for him and that asking him to make it was also not what she was going to do. She had $22,000 in a savings account that she had been building since her first Army deployment. 9 years of base pay and combat zone bonuses and money saved in places where there was nothing available to spend it on. The fallback reserve, the start-over fund. First and last month on a new property somewhere, moving costs for the horses. Enough margin to attempt something rather than nothing if Callahan Ridge was gone. She withdrew it entirely and retained Margaret Cole Briggs at $250 an hour. On the morning of the third day, the first snow of the season came in light and early, and Nora drove to Billings. Pete had told her the road conditions were deteriorating and would likely be worse by afternoon. She drove anyway, slower than usual, through the sections where the snow was accumulating on the gravel, the wipers on continuous, the mountains to the west invisible in the low cloud. 2.5 hours instead of 90 minutes. The Hargrove Holdings building in Billings was a 4-story glass and steel structure downtown that managed to appear practical rather than showy. The kind of building that said the people inside were doing actual work rather than performing prosperity. The lobby had a reception desk and indoor plants that were alive, and a woman at the desk who looked at Nora's jacket with snow on the shoulders and her hair damp from the parking lot with the neutral expression of a receptionist who had been trained to have neutral expressions. Nora said, "Cole Hargrove. Tell him Nora Callahan is here." She was shown in. The office was large and organized, a working desk rather than a display desk, the kind of surface where decisions actually got made. Large windows with the downtown visible and the mountains invisible behind the overcast. Cole was standing when she came in, and she watched his face register her presence and the snow on her jacket and the damp hair and the 47-page legal file under her arm, and she watched him understand what she had done before she said anything. She crossed the room and put the file on the desk. She said, "The clause is dormant. Vane overplayed it. But to challenge his use of it, you have to go on the record publicly and legally as the owner of Hargrove Land and Cattle operating in Dusty Creek County. Your name in the paper. Everything you have been concealing comes into the open." She stepped back from the desk. "It is your decision. It will cost you something real either way. I am not going to tell you which way to go." Cole looked at the file. He looked at the snow on her jacket. He looked at her face. He was quiet for a long moment that was not the quiet of indecision, but the quiet of someone taking something in fully before responding to it. He saw the tabbed sections and the highlighted statute and the attorney's analysis memo. He saw the work of 3 sleepless nights. He saw $22,000 of savings she could not easily replace spent on the argument, brought to his office without a phone call because she had not been certain he would agree to see her if she had called first. He saw a woman who had built a legal case that would benefit her regardless of whether he participated, and who had brought it to him not to ask for his help but to give him a choice. He picked up the pen. His phone rang from the desk. He looked at the screen, held it for 3 seconds, and set it face down. He went back to signing the first form. Nora watched him set the phone down. She did not know what the call was. She knew from the specific quality of the gesture that it was something significant. She knew he had just put it face down and kept signing. What she did not know was that his attorney had been on the line to tell him that Grant Whitfield had signed the Caldwell Basin deal that morning. The 10-day window had closed 2 days early. The $89 million acquisition, the largest of his career, 14 months of negotiation, was gone. It had gone while he was sitting in a barn in Dusty Creek, not answering calls from Billings. He finished signing. He stacked the forms and handed them across the desk. She took them. She stood for a moment. He said, "I was afraid." That is the true answer to a question you did not ask. Not a test, not an experiment. Afraid in the specific way you become after enough times of being wrong about people, where the decision to stop being afraid is not one you can make just by deciding. She looked at him. "I know. I heard part of the phone call." "When?" "3 weeks ago. I heard the part where you said someone looked at you without calculating. I did not hear the rest of it clearly." He was quiet. She said, "I stayed because I wanted you to tell me yourself. I wanted to see if you would choose the truth when you did not have to." He said, "Why did you not ask me directly?" She said, "Because I was afraid too." The snow outside the windows had gotten heavier in the time she had been in the office, the downtown buildings across the street going soft in the white. She picked up the file and left. After the door closed, Cole sat at the desk for a long time. Then Pete Rourke arrived at the barn that evening to find Nora in the tack room and sat down on the upturned bucket that Pete used for serious conversations and took out an envelope that had been folded and unfolded enough times that the paper was soft at the creases. Pete said, "Your father asked me to hold this until I thought you were ready for it. I have been thinking about the right time for about 8 months. I believe this is it." Inside was a letter from Thomas Callahan dated 6 months before his death, and a single handwritten page of notes on yellow legal paper. Thomas had seen the debt problem coming 24 months before the end. He had reached out through a network of contacts, quietly, the way Thomas did things that mattered to him, looking for a solution that did not require selling the land or compromising the mission of the rescue. One of those contacts had led, through an intermediary, to a conversation with the junior representative of Hargrove Holdings about the possibility of a conservation easement arrangement that could retire the debt and protect the property permanently. Thomas had never known who he was dealing with at the company level. The person he spoke to was a junior associate. The conversation had not led anywhere actionable before Thomas's health deteriorated. But in the yellow paper notes, in Thomas Callahan's plain, direct handwriting, was a line that read, "If anyone from Hargrove ever comes through this part of the county, treat them like people. They listened when they did not have to." Cole did not know this. The job posting that had brought Nora to the interview had been placed because Cole was looking for a legitimate reason to be present in Dusty Creek County. Thomas Callahan's quiet outreach had created conditions that Cole had acted on without knowing they existed, not designed, not entirely accidental, something that occupied the space between the two, where the decisions of people who never met each other combine into outcomes that no individual intended and that could not have been prevented by anyone trying to prevent them. Nora read the letter twice. She sat in the barn with Ember's warm breath near her ear and thought about the access road and the flat tire, and the man in the flannel shirt who had appeared over the ridge like someone who had always been part of the landscape. She thought about her father at his kitchen table with his yellow legal pad, working the problem, making calls, listening when he did not have to. She thought about the cedar plank above the barn door. Every damaged thing deserves a second chance. The ruling came down on a Friday, faster than Cole Briggs had projected, attributed by the attorney to the relative clarity of the violation, and a county judge with a well-documented professional opinion of Douglas Vane that predated this case by several years. The right of first refusal clause was formally ruled dormant and improperly invoked. The Callahan Ridge debt reverted to its original terms and original timeline. The bank was additionally required to return an improperly assessed processing fee from 6 months prior, $3,200, which, together with Nora's paycheck, created a manageable near-term runway. Cole had filed on the record as the owner of Hargrove Land and Cattle as a Hargrove Holdings asset in Dusty Creek County. His name appeared in the Dusty Creek Courier the following Thursday in a story that ran above the fold. Ruth called to say the reaction in town was primarily amused rather than hostile, which was the most Ruth said on the subject. Douglas Vane resigned from the county commission within 48 hours of the ruling. The Montana Division of Banking and Financial Institutions opened a formal investigation. 3 other property owners, having followed the case and recognized their own experiences in it, filed civil suits in County District Court. Vane's development plans for Dusty Creek County were finished. He would spend the next several years in depositions and proceedings, facing judgment at the county level for financial misconduct and abuse of public office. His ambitions for the resort project were done. On the Saturday after the ruling, Nora opened the north gate of the round pen. Not to the smaller working arena, to the full north pasture, 40 open acres with the fence lines far enough away that from where Ember was standing, there were no visible boundaries in the direction that mattered. Cole was at Callahan Ridge. He had driven over that morning, and Nora had been in the barn when he arrived, and she had not sent him away, which he understood as its own kind of answer, the beginning of one, at least. Pete was somewhere on the property doing something that gave them room, which was Pete's specific and long-practiced skill. Ember stood at the open gate for a long moment. She looked at Nora. She looked at the open ground in front of her, the frost-pale grass of early fall, the sky above it the clear pale blue of a season that had settled into itself. She looked at Nora again, the dark, careful eyes running their habitual assessment. Then she ran. Not away from the gate, not away from the people at the gate. Out, into the space, with the specific freedom of an animal that has been contained and is now choosing the direction it goes, choosing it for the first time in a long time, moving with the loose and gathered power of a horse that is running because it has somewhere to be, and the somewhere is everywhere, and the everywhere is enough. Cole stood 3 steps from Nora. Neither of them spoke. They watched the mare run toward a horizon that did not end, the red dun coat bright in the morning light, the scar on her shoulder catching the low sun the way it always did. This was the scene with no dialogue, 2 people and 1 horse, and the sky over Montana doing what Montana sky did, which was to be larger than any other context you had ever stood in, and to make everything that had seemed pressing and definitive seem, if not smaller, then at least proportionate to something. After a long time, without looking away from Ember moving in the far distance, Cole said, "I was afraid." That is the honest answer, not a test and not a game. Afraid the way you get after enough times of being wrong about people, the fear that lodges in you in a way that deciding to stop being afraid does not address. Nora said, "I know, I heard the phone call, the part about calculating. You stayed 3 more weeks after that. I wanted to see if you would choose to tell me. I wanted to see which one of us would go first. Why did you not just ask me?" "Because I was afraid too." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been afraid of the wrong things for a long time. Afraid of the land, afraid of the horses. I know how to manage fear that I can name. It is the other kind that I have trouble with." Ember circled back across the far pasture, dropping from a gallop to a canter to a trot, coming toward the gate with the unhurried confidence of a horse that knows where home is. Cole reached out and rested his hand on the mare's neck as she came to the fence. Nora's hand was already there. Their hands met on the warm horse, and neither of them moved. Cole said, "I will not promise I will not make mistakes." Nora said, "I know. I am promising honesty. That I can do. That is what I asked for." Ember breathed against Nora's shoulder, warm and steady, and the fall sky over Montana was as blue and open as it had been on the morning the foreclosure letter arrived, indifferent and enormous and completely unchanged by anything that had happened since. The difference was that today it did not feel like an insult. Cole Hargrove had spent 38 years building something that could not be taken from him. Standing in a pasture in Dusty Creek County with his hand on a rescued horse's neck, next to a woman who had driven to his office in the first snowstorm of the season to give him a choice rather than ask him for help, he understood that he would trade all of it, the whole accumulated structure, for the specific thing that was happening right now, which was being known by someone who had chosen to know him and had not needed to be offered anything in exchange. He thought that was probably worth noting. 5 o'clock the following morning. Callahan Ridge Barn. Nora had driven home the previous evening after 2 more hours on the Hargrove porch. The kind of conversation that did not resolve everything but established the ground on which resolution could eventually stand. She had come back to her own barn at 5, because that was what she did, and because the horses required it, and because the morning work was the most honest hour of her day, and she was not willing to give it up for anything. Cole's truck was parked outside. He was inside, at Scout's stall, filling the water bucket with the focused attention of someone who was doing a job they had decided to do rather than waiting to be directed. He did not have a key. June had apparently driven out the previous evening, spent the night on the couch, made a decision, let Cole in before she left at 4:30, and returned to Missoula without explaining herself to anyone. This was, Nora reflected, completely consistent with June. She stood in the barn doorway. He looked up. "June let you in." "She did." "Did she give you a speech?" "She gave me a speech. I cannot verify it was the same speech she gave you." "What did she say?" He set down the water bucket. "She said, and I am giving you the exact words, Nora will forgive a lot of things, but she will never forgive being made to feel like a fool. So if you're going to be here all the way, or do not come back." Then she left. Nora picked up a feed scoop. "She is not wrong. I know she is not wrong." They worked through the whole morning feeding, Scout and Ember and the 10 others, without anything further needing to be said, because the saying had been done, and what was left was the doing. And the doing was straightforward and familiar, and had its own completeness that words would not have improved. That was the real reconciliation. Not the conversation in the pasture when Ember ran, not the words on the porch the previous evening, not any single moment of statement or acknowledgement. This, 2 people in a barn at 5 in the morning doing the work because the work needed doing, without ceremony or performance, in the particular ease of people who have found the terms on which they can be themselves in each other's presence. 6 months later, early winter, Callahan Ridge. The debt was manageable. The therapeutic horsemanship program for veterans had launched 8 weeks after the vein situation resolved, built on a contact from Nora's Army service, who had spent the intervening years working in veteran services for a 3-county region, and who had been looking for exactly the kind of program Callahan Ridge could offer. There was a waiting list. Cole had been at Callahan Ridge every weekend since September without discussion or announcement, the visits becoming the fixed structure of his week, the way the 5 o'clock barn shift was the fixed structure of his day. He had figured out how she took her coffee within the first 2 weeks, and had been bringing it without comment since then. He was a man who paid attention when attention was warranted and had decided that this warranted it indefinitely. On a December morning, he came to the barn at 5 and set the coffee on Ember's stall door and set something else beside it. A copper ring, plain band, thinned on one side from decades of wear, darkened to near black with the kind of age that is not neglect but accumulation. It sat on the painted stall door in the cold barn air like a fact waiting to be acknowledged. He said, "My grandmother's. My grandfather bought it the first year they were working the ranch together. He could not afford gold. She wore it every day until she died." Nora looked at the ring. She did not look at him. At the ring. She said, "You could buy me anything." "Yes." "And you chose this." "Because it is the only thing I own that says what I mean. Everything else I own I bought because I could. This one I kept because it meant something. I want to give you the thing that means something." "What does it mean?" "That I want to build something with you. Not buy it. Not manage it from a distance through people who call me sir. Build it. With you. Here." She picked up the ring. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the worn thinness of the band, the blackened copper that had spent 40 years on a woman's hand through everything that a life contains. She slid it onto her finger. It fit. No question was asked. None was needed. They were married in November on the low ridge behind Callahan Ridge, the ridge Thomas Callahan had walked to at the end of each working day to stand and watch the horses run in the last light. Pete had walked up here every November 14th, Thomas's birthday, since the old man died. The view was the same in every direction, grass and fence and mountain and sky, and there was nothing about it that would have photographed as spectacular, and nothing about it that was not exactly right. Light rain came in sideways during the ceremony. The soft Montana November rain that was not cold enough to be unpleasant, and was warm enough to feel like permission rather than weather. It made everyone's hair damp and nobody mentioned it. June was there, in a dress that was too light for the temperature and a jacket that compensated, crying quietly and making no effort to conceal it. Pete wore his good shirt, pressed with the focused attention of a man who did not expect to need it again soon. Ruth McKay had driven 2 hours in the wrong direction without explaining why, and stood at the edge of the small group with her arms folded and an expression that was as close to soft as Ruth McKay's face got. Senator Dale Hargrove had flown from Washington without being asked twice and stood in the back with his hat in his hands, watching his nephew with the expression of a man being proved wrong about something and finding the experience better than he had expected. Scout was at the pasture fence with his head over the rail, 23 years old, watching everything with the unhurried authority of something that had been here long before any of this and intended to be here after. Ember was at the nearest fence post. The vows were short. They had each written their own and had not shared them in advance. Nora said, "I choose you because you are honest, not because you are perfect. I will keep choosing you on the days when you are honest about being imperfect." Cole said, "I choose you because you sat down in the dirt and waited for a damaged thing to learn to trust you. I did not understand that was what I needed until I watched you do it." Pete, standing next to June, turned his face away for a moment. June saw him reach up to his face. She had the good sense not to say anything about it, which was the most restrained she had been in years, and which she considered a genuine act of love. 2 years later, Callahan Ridge was 60 acres. Cole had transferred the deed for the adjacent 20 acres, acquired through Hargrove Holdings some years prior, into Nora's name. No conversation about it, no ceremony. A document on the kitchen table one morning under a coffee cup, the coffee placed with the precision of a man who knew exactly how it was taken. She had read the deed, set it down, and said thank you. That exchange was sufficient for both of them. 18 horses were in residence. 4 were enrolled in the active therapeutic program, which now had a formal referral relationship with the VA and a 2-month waiting list. Pete still worked the barn every morning, though there were 2 younger hands sharing the load now. A concession Pete had made without admitting it was a concession, and which had added approximately an hour to his evening, which he used to sit on the porch and drink coffee and watch the light go off the mountains. Cole was in the barn most mornings before 6, still in flannel, still in the same boots that Ruth had been commenting on for 2 years, the comments having evolved from practical to affectionate without anyone marking the transition. The Hargrove Holdings office in Billings had a COO now who was excellent at the corporate side of the operation, which freed Cole to be where he had decided he wanted to be, which was here most of the time, doing the work. One thing was new. A child sat on the top rail of Ember's paddock fence in the early morning light. 3 years old, feet not reaching the second rail. Both hands wrapped around a halved apple held flat, the way you hold something when you want to offer it without taking it back, offered toward the red-dun mare in the paddock with the complete confidence of someone who has not yet been taught to be cautious. Red-brown hair, her mother's. Eyes that watched everything quietly, taking their time. Her father's. Ember walked over. She lowered her head and sniffed the apple with the slow, deliberate attention of a horse that trusts but verifies. Then she took it from the small hands, with the careful gentleness of an animal that has learned the specific difference between something fragile and something that can take roughness. Nora stood at the barn door with her coffee, watching. Cole stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders, watching their daughter and the mare, and the particular quality of the early morning light. Neither of them spoke for a while. The spring morning carried the smell of wet soil and new grass, and the clean cold of snowmelt running off the mountains somewhere above the tree line. The sky was the full pale blue of early Montana spring, the color that only exists in this latitude and this elevation. The color that people who have seen it try to describe to people who have not, and always find the description insufficient. Cole said quietly, "She is not afraid." Nora said, "She learned from you." He looked at her. "From me." You sat down and waited for something that did not trust you yet. You just did not know that was what you were doing at the time. Cole thought about the round pen and the woman sitting in the dirt with her back to the horse. He thought about 11 years of a grandfather's knife, handed over to cut baling twine without a second thought. He thought about the access road and the flat tire and the morning he had come over the ridge on foot, and a woman had told him her name, and he had said his first name only and kept walking. And he thought about all the distance between that morning and this one, and how much of it had been covered not in any single brave moment, but in the slow daily increment of being the same person every time. Scout leaned over his stall door behind them, investigated the back of Cole's jacket with the thoroughgoing attention of a horse who has been doing this for 20 years and still holds out hope that something interesting will eventually be found there, and withdrew. Above the barn door, in red paint that had been weathered by 20 years of Montana seasons, but had not faded to the point of illegibility, the cedar plank said what it had always said: every damaged thing deserves a second chance. The child on the fence rail held out the other half of the apple, offering it back toward Ember with the same flat-palmed patience, and the mare came and took it with the same careful gentleness, and the morning held everything it needed to hold, and asked nothing of anyone that had not already been given. The land kept its promises, the horses kept theirs. The people on the ridge behind the barn, watching their daughter feed an apple to a horse that 3 trainers had given up on, kept theirs too, in the small daily ways that do not require witnesses, and do not require ceremony and amount, over time, to everything. That was enough. That was, in the specific accounting that mattered on a 60-acre rescue operation outside Dusty Creek, Montana, on a spring morning with the snowmelt coming off the mountains, absolutely everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.